Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Vincent Chan. I'm the Chief China Equity Strategist for Credit Suisse. Today I'm hosting a panel with the topic of, as you can see, doing business in China. What's the reality? Now, I think as we all know, from late 90s onwards, China is probably one of the most important markets for many multinational corporations. And it has been sustaining its high growth in the last couple of years. However, in the last few years, we heard more and more concern, mostly from the press, about the difficulties of foreign companies in doing their business in China, in areas like intellectual property rights protection, in areas like the government's demanding more domestic contents in their production business in China, and rising labor costs, etc., etc. So today, we're hosting this panel to give you an idea of the reality of really doing business in China. And I think the three speakers here are very distinguished individuals which could tell us about the real situation. Sitting on the right-hand side is Mr. Mark Allen. He's the president of Boeing International. I think, well, we don't need to explain what Boeing is all about, okay? They sell aircraft, simply. But anyway, Mark will give us a more detailed description of his company and what he does later. And sitting in the middle is Mr. Robert Buchbauer. He is the member of the executive board and the CEO of the Consumer Goods Division in Daniel Swarovski Corporation. I think you also know what is Swarovski about, okay? So I don't also need to further explain. Sitting on the far right-hand side, Mr. York Wugtao. I hope I pronounced it correctly. He's the president, well, one of his identities, the president of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. He is also the head of BASF in China as well. But today, he's speaking on behalf of the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China. Now, for time constraint, I think it's better to do this panel in a more question and answer section. I will ask a few questions first, and then afterwards, I will open to the floor for the discussion. Now, let me ask the first question to all the panelists is about how do you describe the current business environment in China, and what are the top three problems you encounter in China? And most importantly, I think the second part of the question, more importantly, is how does it compare to the situation 5 years ago? So York, do you mind to start first?
Okay, we start with the least known organization. So let me just say I'm heading the European Chamber of Commerce in China. We have nearly 2,000 members. We have 9 offices across China, and AmCham and us are sort of the ones that do the big position papers, the recommendations, we comment on legislation, and if there are restrictions up, we are the guys who speak up. So I'm really only speaking in this capacity today and not in my company capacity. Actually, I came here in order to find out what the reality on China is. So I'm surprised I have to say something coherent. Compared to 5 years ago, I think what we experienced is really a game change, because China was very easy, predictable, double-digit growth, sometimes 10, sometimes 11, 12. And now I think the extrapolation is out the window. We cannot extrapolate China anymore. If you're doing business in that vast country, I would rather also say continent of China, as, for example, my own country, Germany, is with 82 million people, fits neatly into Shandong province, size-wise and population-wise. Not GDP yet, but so it is something where you just have to see that China is developing on a slower trajectory. The growth pattern has totally changed, and unlike the European Union, with its 28 member states, China is developing very different province to province and city by city. I think that's really something that also European Chamber is trying to reflect. We normally come out with these big 400-page position paper in September. Now, basically, we have launched a Shanghai position paper, 8th of April, Beijing position paper, and in June we come out with South China, because we want our members to understand that Europe, Germany is developing, and Sweden on a different pattern than Italy and Portugal and Spain and so forth. China will go down this road as well. China will very different growth pattern. In Northeast, for example, Heilongjiang, it is possibly now at 5% or less, whereas Guangdong is still doing quite well. So when we talk about China, The thing that maybe you should stick with you first, it's a continent. And like Europe, where Germany might have solid growth through the crisis, others might get a real hit. I have not identified the Greece of China yet. Shanxi might qualify. But it is something you really have to look at. It's not going to be China anymore. It's region by region. And this kind of we go west and develop west and we close the gap, this might not happen. So this is the biggest difference for me, is that the growth pattern is so different now. And China becomes, in this sense, far more unpredictable.
Who want to move it?
Well, thank you. Maybe a few words on my company as well before I go into the actual topic of China and what has changed. Swarovski has been around for 120 years. We are celebrating a little anniversary this year. Interesting enough, family owned 100% by the 5th generation and the 4th generation. So a little bit different from all the other companies, or most of the other companies represented in one or the other way here. We've been doing business in China for quite a long time. We entered at a very early stage, and you have to understand that our company runs 2 main business models, one being a B2B model, where we basically sell faceted crystal stones to the industry. That means to jewelry companies, to fashion companies, to shoemakers and the like, who all use our crystal stones as an ingredient to their product in order to make it even more sparkling. And then there is the other business that actually I'm responsible for, which is the consumer goods business. We sell finished products, mainly jewelry with crystal and crystal objects, to the consumers through the various channels, mainly through our own retail channel, our Swarovski branded retail stores. As I said, we've entered China at a very early stage, so we were able to build the brand from scratch. In the beginning, with a network of partners only, and as soon as it became possible to get a retail license, we applied for a retail license and started building our own distribution parallel to what we did with our partners. Today we have like 240 Swarovski stores in China. Thereof we operate 120 by ourselves, and the other 120 are being operated by our partners. And we actually are still in the rollout phase of that retail concept. We're entering 3rd and 4th tier cities now. And that way we're able to penetrate the market to its full extent. Nevertheless, over the past years, we've seen a lot of things change there. Today, we are faced with some issues when it comes to retaining good talent in the company. The war for talent is definitely on in China. I think this is something that a lot of other companies have to face as a challenge as well. Then for us, of course, the war for locations, for the best locations. And since we've entered very early, we have a lot of good locations. I got a lot of good stores there. So we have quite some companies going after us and try to take over our space, which we have to counteract, of course. And then I think there's also a lot of opportunity that we have there. So my company is still growing in China. I think that's the good news. And we see more room for expansion. I think the GDP, if you look at it on a purchase parity, from a purchase parity point of view, is basically on par with the US. So I think we'll have a lot of more opportunities for growth as well. But regulatory environment, etc., also gives us a hard time. So I think it's a mix of opportunities and threats that we find at the moment. And in order not to take too much of your time now, I'll hand over to you, Mark, and maybe continue with my story later on.
Well, good afternoon. I'm in the airplane business, so center of gravity matters. So all of you packed into the back, there's another door if you want seats on this side. You never want the plane to tilt. Growth is still happening in China, and our business is at least one great reflector of that. Start with the passengers, and 2014, we saw an increase of around 11% on the passengers traveling domestically, in the 20s actually for those going outbound internationally. Really strong numbers. And that's growing on a base where only a third of the population take on average one trip a year. Contrast that with the United States, where across the entire population, everybody takes on average 3 trips a year, and you see the remaining gap. So let me back up and tell you a little bit about our company and what we do in China and how we approach that incredible opportunity. First of all, we've been in China since Nixon arrived. He came on a Boeing 707, and appropriate, don't you think? While there, he signed a contract for 10, which was even more appropriate, we thought. And that the first Boeing airplane under that sales contract arrived about a year later. So we have been in country now for about 42 years. It's a long history relative to many of the Western companies. We, at this point, have facilities that produce component parts that go back to the United States for our final assembly. We have service businesses on the ground there. We have training businesses on the ground. We do flight navigation. It's a total population of about 2,500 Boeing employees in those subsidiaries, another 4,000 or so in some minority-held JVs. So it's a pretty sizable bit of investment we've made in the country. We are the single largest company delivering large airplanes to China each year, 155 last year. And just by way of comparison, we were delivering in the 70s per year just about 4 years back. So the growth curve on that, you can do the math with the rule of 72, is pretty strong. We see that trend continuing going forward, no major changes. But for us, when you ask the question about what are the challenges in China, every business has challenges in every market. There's none that's easy, and China is particularly complex, of course, notoriously so. But I'll just flag here a couple that are important to us. One is capacity, and that's principally around airspace. In the Western world, you tend to see airspace divided up 80% for civil use, 20% for military. And in China, the ratio is reversed. Why does that matter? Well, the more things get congested, the more you get flight delays, and you've all probably experienced it trying to fly from Shanghai to Beijing. And if that drives you to take the high-speed rail, then we get very concerned.
I'm starting to take the high-speed rail, by the way.
So for us, getting airspace capacity is important. And frankly, that's a policy issue. It has to be driven at the highest levels. For us, it's equally about capacity around talent. You mentioned talent, and for us, that's pilots, that's mechanics, that's the infrastructure, the people infrastructure that can support the air transport system. And there's a lot of work to be done in order to enable that to keep up with the radically fast passenger growth that we see there. Those are just two to start. I'm sure you'll bring up some others we can talk about on the panel. But we're excited about China. It's a great opportunity. And we intend to be there for the next 42 years as well.
Good. Well, given that most of you have your companies have long history of operating in China, next question, I'd like to focus a little bit more on government policy and regulations towards foreign business. Because I think our impression is that, my impression at least, up until 2005, I think 2005, 2006 is the kind of line I cut. Before that time, I see China is actually rather open to foreign companies. Indeed, one of the most open in the world at that time. But it seems that in the last couple of years, this kind of policy seems to be a little bit changing to be more tight, etc. We increasingly hear more concern about antitrust, recently anti-corruption, okay, and the internet security, domestic content requirement, etc., etc. These kind of issues. How do you see these kind of things affecting your business and affecting your confidence in putting more investment in China? Again, I think the more interesting point is now versus like 5 years ago, 10 years ago. Who would like to be the next one? Robert, do you mind?
Sure. Well, I think as an economy grows, I mean, there's naturally more need for regulation. I think this is also a natural law. But the question is always how fast do you move forward with imposing those regulations or putting them in place, and how strict are you going to be with the enforcement, or how far do they affect our overall business environment? And I think up to a certain extent. I can give you one example. I mean, the anti-corruption regulations have affected most of the luxury goods and consumer goods businesses to a certain extent. Now, for our brand, we were lucky that we were able to shift some of, actually all of that business that was done with very highly priced items to a more like personal gifting oriented consumer. We were lucky because we have those products, and we have plenty of those products that are accessible in their price points. So we were able to counteract that trend that you could see in general. That holds true for our business in mainland China. Now, I want to give you another example where we were not able to offset that or to counteract that trend, and that's what's currently happening in Macau. The good news for us is that Macau, in total numbers overall, is small for us, but we see quite a sharp decline, and that decline is directly proportional to the decline in the gambling in Macau. And in Macau, I think the retail is 100% linked to the gambling, because the gambling drives the traffic into the shopping centers, into the malls, into the freestanding stores. And I think this is a good example of an overreaction also of the clientele that is so scared at the moment that they simply don't come anymore. And I think this is exactly where I say maybe you're moving too fast, or maybe you're going too far, although in general you move into the right direction as an economy and as a society.
Yeah. Ma?
You know, I believe the government at the highest levels has made a decision to accept a trade-off on growth for the continuing drive against corruption. I think that's been a clear decision. And so that means it will have an impact, but I don't think any of us can quantify it. And so it's a little bit, for all of us, eyes wide open, recognizing there are some question marks. But that means it's just all the more important to look to the fundamentals of each sector.
Right.
And different sectors, I expect, are going to behave differently in the face of some of those trade-offs. You know, if I step back and just think about our business and compare it to 5 years ago, you know, what's changed? Well, the sophistication of the entire system has changed a great deal. The sophistication of the regulator, the sophistication of the airlines, and the sophistication of the consumers, the travelers. And it's that change that introduces a lot of dynamicism in terms of how businesses like ours and the airlines are both having to respond. Just as one little anecdote, with a country of 1.4 billion people, it's not a surprise that the Chinese civil aviation regulator would expect to establish itself as a peer with the other major regulators of the world, whether it be the US or Europe or Canada or elsewhere. And as they do so, it changes the dynamic for OEMs working with them in terms of the expectations for processes that will apply that may not have applied 15 years ago, and for the way in which they're applied. So that is changing behaviors, and it just always takes a while for industries and companies and regulators to adjust to changing behaviors. Right. So I think for us, that's one of the major 5-year changes.
Yeah.
Well, it has changed. I've been living in China for 25 years, so it's a long video I could report on the investment climate changes. But very often, in particular in the 90s, you had a straitjacket. It was not always easy, but in many areas, particularly in manufacturing, you had a red carpet. So you walked down the red carpet in a straitjacket, but at least you knew where you're walking to. And so this has changed a lot over the last years. In the chamber, we have done an analysis. We ask our members, and it's really different. Still in car, for example, car parts, it is still incredibly booming. Particularly the Europeans are doing double-digit growth figures, and then you have more the upstream chemicals. You have the lawyers. You have machine building that is going down or is flat since a couple of years. And that also is not only market, but it's also accessibility to this. For example, the lawyers are totally constrained. They have to write an email saying, I can't actually do business in China. It has changed. And as you alluded to 2005, 2006, there was a very grand opening, and that was elaborated by Zhu Rongji in his term, where he opened up China tremendously. You had WTO session. Zhu Rongji wanted competition in. I mean, he cut down the ministries. He cut down on the SOEs and opened up. And that was actually the best time we ever had. He was actually the guy that kick-started this golden age, as we would call it, 10 years of 10, 12%. And during this 10 years of 12% growth, under the Wen Jiabao, Hu Jintao era, actually it closed. Some areas it significantly closed the opportunities. For example, the Chinese took over the forced technology transfers and so forth. And in some areas, it just went on. It was absolutely no problem. So it's China, again, is so diverse that if you say, is it more open, less open, depends on which segment you're looking at. So now they say, you know, we open up and we have the attempt to have less categories on this NDRC catalog. The NDRC catalog tells you if you can invest and where you can invest and to what extent you can invest. And Li Keqiang said, you know, we cut it down in NPC 2 weeks ago, but if you look at the details, yes, the numbers are down, but it made, frankly, no difference. I'll give you one example, refining. Refining basically now used to be a minority for foreigners, now it's 100%. But if you talk to the oil companies, basically they have no interest, because why should I add another refinery to a segment which has overcapacity and I don't have access to gasoline stations? Mm-hmm. So at the end, you still have this missing link to the end consumer, which they feel like they don't want to give on. So it's really a huge challenge. I mean, kerosene is a monopoly at the Beijing airport, servicing your planes.
You know, one thing I was going to add is, if you're I said before, sector by sector.
Yep.
I think it really matters to look out and see what the regulators have been doing with capacity controls sector by sector. Mm-hmm. So if you think about steel, right, concrete, we all know the excess capacity that the industries have had to deal with. But there are a whole other set of industries, and ours is certainly one, where the regulator has been very careful, and I would say conservative. That's been driven by the focus on safety in air transport, and the understanding that if you have excess capacity, the system gets stressed more, you're more likely to have safety incidents, right, and those are simply unacceptable.
Right.
The result is we feel pretty good that we don't face an excess capacity situation because the regulator has kept something of a control on that. Mm-hmm. So sector by sector is where you're going to find investment opportunities depending on what the regulators have been doing. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Good. But it seems that while you discuss the general regulatory conditions, if we go more specific into issues like, I think recently, the issues like controlling internet security, Ukraine domestic content, it seems, well, can you either of you comment on these specific issues, these two specific issues, yes, the requirement of more domestic content in the production and the requirement for internet security? Because I see that your chamber
I just want to protect my colleagues because I'm not sure you want to have a Swarovski and Boeing statement on that one. But it's two things in China right now, that the chamber, European Chamber spoke up in February and lamented the speed of the internet, which is topic number one. And it was very interesting. 86% said it's a problem for business, a constraint to business development. AmCham had a very similar data with 81%. They just did a survey this week. Comes out the result, I think, next week. But what was more interesting to us is that 13% of our members said because of the constraints in the internet, they will not do investment in the R&D sector. Meaning that it's so slow you can't send big files, you have constraints of accessing websites and so forth. So we were trying to communicate to the leadership that it's not just a very slow internet, but it really has an impact on business in a time when economic slowdown takes place. China is, at least a year and a half ago, was 96 in the pecking order of internet speed. South Korea '1, I think Germany is 10 or 12, and Kazakhstan is 95, and China is 96. And now it's even worse because in December they tightened it. So topic number one is really the issue we have in particular in the west of China is speed. The second is what you're alluding to is the information communication technology. that has been so prominent in the newspapers recently. And all the chambers that spoke up, that normally are the ones that where members turn to, AmCham did a letter to the Chinese authorities as well as White House and others, and even the Japanese that normally never speak up, and European Chamber also, we wrote a letter to the President, Parliament, as well as to the signed a letter last week to the Chinese government. So in a way, it is a concern, and the point here is that the banking regulator has given out a paper that forces operating banks in China to have a controllable and secure internet service solution. What that means is that you have to possibly buy 75% locally until 2019. To give you a feeling, most of the European banks we asked have a local content of 5%. And they tell us they cannot operate internationally in China as well without the Oracles, the EMC Squares, the IBMs, the SAPs, and so forth. So now how does China want to implement this? By forcing banks operating in China to have a totally different system from their global operations. So does China want to be an intranet? Does it want to be two systems that, don't want to mention a Swiss bank now, but does someone have to have a system in China that is very different and has to have an interface with a global system? Again, I don't know why this came up, more security concerns, or is it making space for the local providers in order to push outside these companies? But we have for the first time had an international outcry that pushes this back. And why did we cry out so loud, so to speak, is we are worried about this being the first step, communications being second step, maybe then the insurance sector and so forth. And this is very, very in contrary to this openness, reform, and we welcome foreigners, and then basically you force operating companies in China to buy local at 75% in 2019. So we don't know how that's going to shape up. Deadline was March 15th, so it passed. And we have to see how that is being implemented. The good news about China is they sometimes are very flexible on a couple of things they realize is a mistake.
Mark, do you assume?
A different point. One of the things that I think China has done is your idea of fail fast. They've kind of adopted from Silicon Valley in policy. They've been willing to fail fast. That means that sometimes it works and they stay with it, and other times they're willing to step back and try something else. And I think of the catalog, right? The government procurement catalog a few years ago that they moved back away from after an international outcry. That flexibility is important because it means that there's space for collaboration and dialogue at the bilateral, multilateral level. And that's very important. That's a good sign for all of us there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I asked one more question, and then I open it to the floor. About the local companies competition. I think, well, probably 10, 15 years ago, most of the business in which the foreign companies are in, the local companies cannot compete. Nowadays, the capability seems to be improved a lot in areas like telecom equipment, and even China is starting to building a civilian aircraft, and some Chinese consumer goods companies are starting to go to the high-end products. So how do you see, from an operation angle, how do you see the competition from local business, again, now compared to 5, 10 years ago? Robert, do you want?
Well, of course, like from a consumer goods and luxury goods perspective, we see a lot of things going on. A lot of companies entering our core market, which is the fortunately still growing jewelry market, overall growing and projected to grow around 8% for the next few years, which means there is space for players, for international players, for local players, but they come up. And a few trends that we see is, as in the past, some of the companies, they just entered the market and tried to imitate some of the concepts they've seen out there, or copy some of the products, or do something similar. What we can see as a tendency is that there's more and more like branding and also design expertise flowing into that market. That means what I see is like Chinese competition in the broad sense becoming more and more self-confident. Definitely successful from a business perspective, some of them really big, specifically Chinese brands inside China, Chinese companies inside China. There's a lot of brands that international consumers don't even know yet on the international platforms, but they are very well established in China. On the other hand, I have to say, in my industry, competition has always been a good thing because it forces you to innovate, it forces you to move forward, it forces you to even become better, it forces you sometimes even to drive the consolidation of a market. In our case, that market is very fragmented and growing, which is good news again, and brands become more and more important. So if you're able to further build your brand in such a market and with such a competition, actually it's to the benefit of the consumer, and that should ultimately also be to the benefit of your own business.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Competition is a catalyst. It's a catalyst for excellence, and it drives you. We have been some of the first over the last several years to speak up and say we absolutely believe that the Chinese are best positioned among the many across the world who are trying to compete with large civil aircraft. They're the best positioned to do it. The Civil Aviation Administrator of China announced this year that he expects their large commercial airplane to fly before the end of 2015. Whether it's this year or next year, that's still pretty good relative to their early timeline. So absolutely, they are focused on developing their own product, and it will compete with ours. But we have, as I said, we came to China early, and we came on the basis of partnerships. And so for us, we look at COMAC, which is the name of the Chinese company making the large commercial airplane option that they have. And we look at them as both a great competitor and a great collaborator. And what we've done is we've said, how can we make the pie bigger for all of us? And so we have entered into agreements with them around biofuel development, around air traffic management research, as well as other efforts to build and design more capacity in the system. They're, of course, uniquely positioned to help us drive capacity in the system because they report directly to the State Council. And so as we build that partnership with them, there's a real opportunity to expand the pie and for us both to succeed in different ways. Now, plainly, we have our own secret sauce of innovation that we're gonna always maintain. And meanwhile, we're going to run fast to try to create more innovation. But wherever we can collaborate with them in a way that's useful and productive, we will, because they really are a first-rate group, and we've enjoyed the partnerships we've already had with them.
Do you think that, because you mentioned earlier, that airspace is actually a very big constraint on aircraft industries, do you think if China can produce their own aircraft, which means that they need to create a market for it, do you think by then this civilian defense airspace 20-80% rule could be increased to like 30-70 or even 40-60 to create a bigger market for everybody?
I don't think domestic production will be what impacts that. I think that'll just be a very high-level policy decision about how to gauge growth and how fast to allow the market to develop. It'll be about a constraint, and as the ceiling starts to get bumped into, I think it won't be big steps. I think it'll be incremental steps forward.
Okay, understood. Jörg, do you have anything?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the segment you're looking at. If China's the only country building nuclear power stations, then the likes of Areva and Westinghouse just have no other place to go. And of course, technology has to be brought to China, and then all of a sudden China has the technology in order to build a nuclear power station in Britain, for example. The same for high-speed trains. I mean, they came from nowhere and now have the biggest high-speed system in the world. And with all these companies competing, be it Japanese, be it German, be it Canadian, now who's competing on projects in the United States and elsewhere is Chinese companies. So, I mean, China has managed to take advantage of this kind of unique situation. Only we built this stuff in order to get the technology. And now most of these countries are sub-suppliers. To the point where now in Boston, I think the Chinese built a subway because now Beijing, from nowhere, with just one line, when I moved to China years ago, now have I think the second largest subway system globally. So that is really something, as there is big demand and companies see nowhere else, they get their technology and are turned into sub-suppliers, the likes that in electrical engineering and so forth. And then you have areas where you still do well as foreign companies, healthcare equipment, fine chemicals do quite well, and some robots and so forth. Then it remains to be seen how the world demand is keeping those companies busy in order to have diverse sales channels in order not to again fall into this trap of trains and nuclear stations. And then areas that are very changing. I mean, years ago it was just Volkswagen had 50% of market share. Then it went down to 10%, and now they're back at 20%. And everybody thought the Chinese are going to roll out one model after the other. And turns out to be they're losing market share now. The BYDs, the Cherries, the Geelys. That 5 years ago everybody thought that they're going to be the ones that also attack global markets, and they find it very difficult. Now we have very strong sales, in particular for German companies. French do also quite well. Americans, GM does extremely well in Ford. And Chinese are really taking a hit to domestic companies. So it's not a straight line. So what I can caution there is really extrapolation is out. Don't assume that given also this price, the cost structure problem that China faces, land cost goes up, financial cost goes up, you have utility cost, electricity, gas, water, aside labor. Assumption is that if you look at 2025 and 2005, cost structure in these areas could be 2 to 3 times. And then China has to see how, with the renminbi, is going to be able to sell. So it's really not a straight line and very, very complicated there.
Okay, I think we have only around 15 minutes left, so I probably left the floor open. Anybody has any question? Like this gentleman on the right-hand side.
Thank you, gentlemen. One question for Mark. Actually, for China, on some specific industry, they force foreign companies to join JV, like automobiles, like your aviation-related industry. So how, like on the ground, how do you protect your IP, honestly, given all these like national strategy to get technical transfer? Thank you.
We've certainly never been forced. The JVs we have are JVs that we chose to do for our own particular reasons. In the business case, they closed. So I don't have direct experience, perhaps, to help on the question. But I will say that what we do around the world in every jurisdiction is ask ourselves, what's the productivity opportunity in this market? And different markets have different things to offer. So whether it's intellectual resources of a particular type or production resources of a type or financial resources of a type, we normally go in with a pretty focused effort to tap that resource. What we found has been a great opportunity to build our supply chain in China. We've been building components in China for decades now. And if you look around the world, there are 8,000 airplanes flying that have China-made rudders and ailerons and elevators and vertical fins and leading edges of wings, really important components to the control surfaces of the airplanes that we produce. So that was something we saw early on. China had its own commitment to develop capability in. And we recognized that we could have a real productivity gain ourselves if we brought them into our supply chain and worked with them aggressively on that. And so we've done that, and it's been a great partnership.
Oh, this lady in the front.
This is also to Mark. Following on that comment, understood that there's a business case and it makes sense to do it, but when you come across partners or potential partners, what are the thoughts and the process that you go about selecting the one that you would like to work with? And then once you've selected it, kind of like what's the due diligence that you do around that?
Well, I guess the first thing that I find has been most powerful in the places where we've entered into partnerships is just the human connection. The sense that we look at the world and the management issues likely to arise in the case of any opportunity, any joint venture or other collaboration in the same way. And so when we find executives at the companies we work with that seem to really share our view of how to manage, how to think about communication, how to think about business ethics and conduct, how to think about the technical and technological aspects of what we're doing, when that syncs up, then we can commit. So that's almost a first order before you get to the business case and start to measure out the data. Because if that doesn't sync up, you run into trouble. And I have war stories from a lot of colleagues. In an earlier job, I was the head of Boeing China, and I used to hear a lot of friends of mine who were running other China operations for other companies who had just war stories about the JVs they were in. And it always came down to the fact that the interests were so badly misaligned, I shouldn't even say aligned, but misaligned between the parties. The interests were aligned, and then the way they thought about those interests often didn't align, and that was, I think, a real challenge for them.
The question, the lady on the side.
Yeah, hi. This is a question for Mr. Wuttke. In your capacity as the head of the European Chamber of Commerce, I wonder if you could elaborate a little more on a point that you alluded to, referencing the RMB and the intentions China has for the currency in a sort of 5-year view.
As I said, extrapolation is out, so you can't really judge. I mean, yesterday, Mark and myself were at the China Development Forum, and when you look at all this reform talk, you see what they promise and what they actually deliver. The financial area, in particular, and around the central bank, are the guys that actually move the fastest. And in particular, Zhou Xiaochuan made it clear that he wants to speed up the convertibility of the renminbi. So the chamber doesn't have a position on the renminbi. We see that our members, because most of them produce in China for China, we import components from Europe that we put into, say, a car, have benefited mightily from the exchange rate gains against the renminbi recently. But where that story is going to head, nobody knows. I mean, the writing that we get and the briefing is always going to end up, China's going to depreciate the renminbi. And once this writing comes up, they go from 620 to 614. So, you know, where's the consistency there? I think that what the central bank really would like also to achieve is volatility in order to kill the carry trade, kill kind of easy banking, meaning that I take a debt out here and pay it back because the renminbi gets stronger. I think that's out the window. People were taking, I don't know how many billions of dollars of loans in Singapore and Hong Kong because they knew the renminbi is going to appreciate, and now they're caught in the act. Things have really changed over the last 6 months. So I don't know, Zhou plays it quite cool. He was very, I think he was the most impressive speaker at the China Development Forum, so we can all hope that he stays in the job, but the chamber doesn't have a renminbi position.
Any further questions from the floor? Maybe I ask a question from John earlier, because you mentioned a point that in your first answer to my question is, you say that before 5 years ago, China is one entity. Everywhere is growing at 10%, so it doesn't really matter, the differentiation. Nowadays, you say that the differentiation starts to come along. Can you tell us, not just you, maybe the other two speakers as well, in which part of China, geographically, or you can separate into big cities, small towns, or you can separate in by geographical locations, what areas in China are growing the fastest? And what areas are more problematic? Yeah.
I think that when you look at particularly the last 6 months to 12 months, the Northeast has a serious problem. They're energy rich, oil, they have coal, and coal price dipped by a lot. Investments has been put on hold. Companies don't put capex there anymore. So if you look at Liaoning and Heilongjiang, I mean, they really have a very hard time. They have massive overcapacity in construction. Some cities like Inkou have an apartment stock, I think, of 8 to 12 years. So basically no construction needed for 8 years to put your people in there. So that's a real constraint is the Northeast. The coastline still does quite well. In particular, the more south you go, the better it is. Guangdong is still a powerhouse in many areas. The supply chain they built up, the kind of clusters they have developed, these are very, very difficult to undo and shift elsewhere in the world. And I think Guangdong so will always remain relatively strong. And then you have central China in the west. Yangtze up is sort of okay. Chengdu and Chongqing do quite well. But the coal-rich region of Ningxia, Shanxi, and so forth is really taking a hit big time. Taiyuan, I think, reported 0% growth. And you never know Chinese statistics. So if there's 0.1%, you can imagine how the real picture look like. If you look at, but for us, in my company and also my peers, the biggest challenge is to find out where is GDP growth and how strong is it. We look at floor space under construction, we look at diesel, we look at all these energy data, and it's sometimes distorted and very difficult to figure out. For example, one area that still has a huge future and has a big potential, I think, is Xinjiang. You have a lot of oil, you have a lot of coal, you have a lot of gas, and now this whole thing of the government is this one belt, one border, the Silk Road, $40 billion going into that, connecting China with Europe, their largest market after all, and lining up basically the countries in between. I would say this is a distinctive growth region and growth pattern that will develop, and people haven't seen it yet. From meetings I had over the last 3 days, companies actually are really trying to use resource-rich Xinjiang and ship it to Europe. It sounds mad to you, but from Xinjiang it's 4,000 kilometers to Shanghai and 6,000 kilometers to Germany, so it's not much difference.
Interesting.
May I comment maybe from a different angle? When we talk about, like, growth potentials, future potentials of China, we try to apply a different approach now in my company. We rather than looking at regions or areas in China only, we try to look at the Chinese consumer in general, meaning the Chinese consumer, of course, has big potential inside the country, inside mainland China, but they also have big potential when they travel, and we see a lot of Chinese consumers traveling, consumers that are relevant to our company. And last but not least, we also see a lot of ethnic Chinese in other cities, in other countries, in their Chinese communities, again offering potential. So from that perspective, just maybe as an idea or as a thought for others as well, you might want to approach that kind of consumer with a different concept, with a different marketing program, because there's a lot of connecting links between those three groups. And for us, just to give you an idea how important China is as a company, we estimate that we do 35 to 40% of our global revenues with Chinese consumers, both inside China, but also outside when they travel or in their local communities in other countries.
That segmentation of consumers, not geographically, but by their interests, is something that's a big part of our current strategy in the marketplace. And for us, it's around the LCC, the low-cost carriers. Mm-hmm. So we've brought in a number of resources over the last few years to work with the airlines to show them the value of operating on a low-cost carrier model. Mm-hmm. In the West, look at the U.S., the traditional, the LCCs tend to be about 40% of the seat capacity in the market. In Southeast Asia, it's around 75%. In China, I don't have the figure on the top of my tongue, but it's very low. It's not close to 35% yet. And so tremendous opportunity there if you really believe that China will be more like Southeast Asia ultimately. Mm-hmm. And so what does that mean? Well, that means that we're spending a lot of time working with the airlines to help them think about how you acquire equipment, assets that match the need, build your route structure, and have a fleet network design that also meets the need. So there's a lot of work to be done. We introduced with Ryanair last year a new airplane called the 737-200, which is very much configured for this type of low-cost carrier, pack-them-in configuration. So to the extent we're right about that, we see a real big opportunity. But again, it's customer segmentation, recognizing that there are going to be consumers who are willing to pay for cheap fares, for conditions that in other parts of the world might not be thought of as right conditions for air travel. So it creates some interesting opportunities there.
Oh, this gentleman at the back first.
Thank you for all of your insights. I think a common theme among all three of you is actually how much China, and especially its different industries, not just in terms of regulators and consumers, but also the industries themselves have evolved for the past several years, becoming pretty much formidable competitors for all the reasons that you mentioned. I guess my question is, at least from your view, but it doesn't necessarily have to be limited to where you're working right now. What would be, in your opinion, China's at least upcoming national champions or sector champions, if you may, of tomorrow, and those that may also struggle, in your opinion? Thank you.
Oh, I've already mentioned Comac, and in our business, it's a pretty short list, so I'll just stop there.
Well, we've seen one big company, Chow Tai Fook, coming up in the jewelry industry. They made a tremendously well-prepared market entry, and actually they're one of the biggest jewelry retailers in the world already. So, as I said before, without the international people actually knowing that they exist, but they're very, very big in China. And at some point in time, they might take the step outside China and start to grow there as well, just as one example. But I'm sure in other industries, there are a lot of other comparable examples as well.
I think that Huawei is an obvious case of a global champion already. SETI is struggling to keep up. I think the car industry will not see a Chinese global champion anytime soon. And then other areas where you sort of have companies like ChemChina buying into Pirelli, are they going to be a global champion? They had 40 acquisitions over the last years trying to incorporate this. What is their strategy? What is their focus on? And that's also going to be difficult. Again, I think we are entering a period of 2 or 3 years of uncertain growth with possibly a lot of bankruptcies, a lot of masterminding mergers. We might end up with a very different landscape 3 years from now. I mean, what I can only say is that straight lines are out, uncertainty is seeping in, and we have to make scenarios and expect our competitors to possibly be very different. We can't rely on our intelligence over the last years and sort of project this.
Thank you, because I think we are already past the time, so we have to wrap up the discussion. Thank you very much for your attendance. Thank you for the speakers. Thank you.